honored to have Beccy here with us. I'm just going to do a very short introduction for her, even though she definitely doesn't need one. But yeah, we're just very lucky. So I'm going to get into it. So Beccy became the RSPB's chief executive in August of 2019. She joined the RSPB having been CEO at the Woodland Trust since 2014, where she oversaw the development and implementation of a 10-year strategy, raising the profile of the Woodland Trust and building many new partnerships. Prior to the Woodland Trust, Beccy previously held the position of general manager at the Stourhead Estate, then director of East Midlands, later Midlands regions, at the National Trust for 14 years. So needless to say, Beccy has been doing this for a very long time, and we're so excited to get some insight into your work, Beccy, and I'm gonna let you take it away from here, and then we'll get to a question period at the end where we would love if all the participants could give us your questions for Beccy. But go for it, Beccy. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. Thank you for that great intro. Listen, it's great to see everybody, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you and answering, well, I'll try and answer any questions that you've got later on, but I thought I'd start off just by, I've got a few slides that I've used elsewhere, just kind of take you through kind of, I suppose, my rather eclectic journey to here, and just kind of sets out some of what I think I've learned along the way that, you know, might be interesting for you and might spark a few questions, and then we can just go into a Q&A or something like that. So I will start without further ado. So if I can have the next slide, please, Faye. Yeah, so this slide is just really just saying, listen, I grew up in Dorset, right down on the south coast, and that picture is the Isle of Purbeck and Winspit in particular, which is this amazing spot if you've ever been there. They kind of used to film Doctor Who there, and kind of a really old sci-fi series that you're probably all too young to know called Blake 7, and they're these fantastic old quarries for limestone, and the name comes from it. Winspit means a stone pit with a winch. And it was named from at least the kind of the 18th century with that name. And it's just an amazing place, really. And growing up in Dorset, I was just surrounded by nature. And then on the right, you've got a whinchat, which is a bird, obviously a small migratory bird. And it's one of the birds that you get at Geltsdale up in, which is our reserve up in Cumbria. And that's where my brother lives. So my brother lives up there now, having grown up with me in Dorset. It's a red listed bird, and it kind of breeds here and winters in Africa. And the numbers in Britain have halved between 1995 and 2008. So it's got a similar trajectory to a lot of those red listed birds in terms of what's going on for their populations. And I just kind of, I love that, from Winspit to Whinchat, because there's a great John Muir quote, you know, the guy who was really behind the founding of the national parks over in America. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of his great quotes, and there are loads of great John Muir quotes, is he says, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything. And that's absolutely true of the natural world. And I think it's true of life. And I think it's true of the way in which we live. So it's just a nice kind of framing, I suppose, for the story I'm going to tell you. So if we move on to the next slide. So this next slide is me with my dad and my brother. And this is us at Beer Woods, which is very close to where I grew up in Dorset. And I remember when I read Chris Packham's book, Fingers in the Sparkle Jar, all about growing up and kind of, you know, catching fish in jam jars and all that kind of thing. That was totally my childhood. And it was only when I went to a kind of a book group that was looking at that book, and I kind of went, yeah, that was totally the way I grew up. And everyone just like looks at me like I was completely mad. And I realized that actually I was so lucky to have that kind of childhood. And even back in the kind of 1970s, it wasn't that common really. And you can see Beer Woods behind us there. It's actually planted ancient woodland. And I think it's part of the woodland that Brian May, the guitarist with Queen, is now doing a lot of work on down in Dorset, just trying to restore it. But really, I grew up with a mother who was mad about wildflowers, so I learned a lot about very specific wildflower names on kind of walks with her. And then my dad was really into the outdoors, so it was all about camping holidays in Wales, in the Channel Islands. We used to go on holiday down to Portland Bill, right down in the south of Dorset, where there are famously kind of lots of migratory birds, and there are a whole lot of kind of huts down there, which have got a long tradition of people, Portlanders, having huts down there. And we used to have friends who would lend us their hut, and then we would illegally sleep in it for 2 weeks and just have a fantastic time. So, you know, kind of fishing, mucking about in boats. You know, it was a really, really kind of rural childhood, and the village was surrounded by 4 farms, all of which were active then. And nowadays I look back and it's interesting. So once there were 4 working farms, now there is just 1. So the others have been developed for housing, or they've become kind of a sort of farm commercial shop, doing kind of, you know, outdoor clothing and that kind of thing, or they've been amalgamated. So just a really interesting change just in my lifetime in the way in which kind of farming works in the UK. And I think I just kind of put this slide up because I think it's really important to be authentic and know where you come from, and know kind of what informs your very being. And I think ultimately, as you get older, I'm 55 this year, you kind of realize that you never lose that. That is very much kind of central to who you are, really. Okay, next slide, please. And this is a bit more of the same. This is Morton Splash. This is very near where I grew up again. And that was a typical summer's day out for me. We'd go down to this kind of local ford. We'd be swimming, we'd be fishing for sticklebacks and blennies, you know, trying to keep the jars upright in the car on the way home while simultaneously eating an ice cream. And I can just, looking at that bridge, I can just feel what it feels like under my feet in the sun, and the kind of the sound it made as you kind of ran up and down it. And I went through kind of all the school systems. So I went to a local village primary school, then I went on to a kind of a convent school till I was 16, and then I went on to a boys' public school for my 6th form, and just kind of a very kind of mixed experience, I suppose. I think kind of that connection to nature was always there. And I think, you know, when you think about that great quote by David Attenborough, that no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced, I think that's absolutely true. And I think I was very lucky to have all of that experience so early on, which has kind of ended up, I think, with me being and who I am today, and doing what I do today as well. Okay, next slide, please. So, but I am absolutely not an ecologist, and I'm not even a geographer. This is a kind of one of those, you know, real physical geography diagrams of a glaciated landscape. But I was always going to do geography at university. That's what I decided. I wanted to do a degree. I wanted to go to university, and I wanted to do geography. And at the very last minute, I switched to wanting to do English instead. That was about kind of, I think, wanting to study something that I absolutely loved, which was kind of English literature. And it took me up to Durham and the north of England, where I'd never really been before, having grown up in Dorset. And it was just post the big miners' strike in the 1980s. And it was a real sort of time of political awakening for me. So I was involved with the Labour Party. I was involved with a lot of fighting for gay rights. And, you know, it was a really interesting kind of period of time in my life, I think. And, you know, I still have lots of connections from that time in my life today. And so even though I would say, you know, that might not have made much sense at the time, I was meant to be doing geography, I was meant to be going somewhere else. I think if I really believe in following your instincts. So if your instincts are telling you to do something or not to do something, I think follow those instincts and just kind of do what your heart feels is right, as well as your head. I think is what I learned from that experience. And so if we move on to the next slide. So now I'm at university, and I kind of never really left my love of nature behind, because this is John Clare, who is one of the Romantic poets and formed part of my degree. And for many years, he was the kind of overlooked romantic poet. He lived from 1793 to 1864, and he's been described as the greatest labouring class poet that England has ever produced. No one has ever written more powerfully of nature, of a rural childhood, and of the alienated and unstable self. And he famously went mad towards the end of his life. And many people think he was kind of driven mad by enclosure, which was when what had once been common land in England was basically fenced off and enclosed. And it was this huge change in the English landscape. And he ended up in an asylum. And he came from Helpston not far from here, really, and basically he famously walked back from the asylum to his home village. And I sometimes think, I drive when I go to Sandy, where the RSPB is headquartered, I drive down what's called the Great North Road, which is the A1, and I sometimes think out of the corner of my eye I just see this little tatty 18th century figure trudging north to get home to Helpston near Peterborough, and trudging north from the asylum. And he was really quite a tragic figure at the end of his life. And you know, it's ironic now that we're kind of mourning the loss of hedgerows. You know, as ecologists and as people who are interested in nature, probably, you know, we're all worried about how few hedgerows there now are in our landscape. But of course, hedgerows only came about really because of enclosure, which was the thing that kind of completely did for John Clare. And there's a great writer, I'm sure you've read some of his books, called Tim Dee, who writes really well about birds. And he said that in the foreword to his, he produced a great poetry anthology in 2011 all about birds. And he noted that Clare wrote about 147 species of British wild birds without any technical kit whatsoever. So this is, you know, pre-binoculars, pre-everything. And I just think what this shows to me is that those cultural links to the natural world are really, really important as a way into it. And I know that Faye was saying that you're going to be kind of possibly looking at kind of, you know, art and links to birds in later on in this kind of series. And I just think that's a really good thing to do. It's just a really interesting way in, and it's often more accessible than the kind of straight science way into birds, I think, is to look at it through culture and through art. And if we look at the next slide, but I wasn't only studying people like John Clare, I was also studying people like Toni Morrison, who lived from 1931 to 2019, and she was the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Prize. She's a sort of recognized as a modern kind of woman writer. But if you wanted to study Toni Morrison in the 1980s, when I was studying her, you did it on a specialist course. She was not seen as mainstream at all. And she's a great person to kind of do some reading on. She said things like, you know, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it. And she also used to say, if you want to fly, you've got to give up the shit that weighs you down. And she was just an amazing thinker and writer. And I think what I learned from kind of studying people like her and my English literature degree, which you might think feels completely alien to what I do now, is I learned about the power of narrative and the power of language, and that kind of all voices count if you're kind of thinking about things like narrative. And I think that stood me in good stead in kind of many things that I've done down the years. If we go on to the next slide. So I kind of finished my English degree and then I kind of thought, oh, what am I going to do now? And I actually ended up doing some teaching English as a foreign language in Spain. And this is a picture of Begara, which is a town in North Spain. And I just had a fantastic time, actually. And it was something completely different. And I just learned so much about kind of organization, communication, imagination, the thrill of kind of teaching a good lesson and getting that immediate feedback from, I used to teach kids and adults, and you just get that immediate buzz back, and just learning how to kind of communicate effectively, I think, from that. And then if we go on to the next slide, I then kind of went up to Edinburgh. I was massively in love and I wanted to be in Edinburgh to be with the guy I was in love with. And I just needed a job. So I kind of ended up working for the council, and they sponsored me through an MBA at Heriot-Watt University. I didn't even know what an MBA was. I was just so lucky that they were prepared to do that. And Edinburgh is a great city. If you've never been, it's a city that's very connected to its surroundings and the outdoors. It's just kind of surrounded by this amazing kind of countryside and sea. And again, I just kind of loved that, and kind of feeling that I was dealing with all sorts of people in my job actually at the council, going to deal with police and kind of people like, you know, janitors who are set in their ways, and had this great phrase I've got on that slide saying, it's always been that way, it's not going to change. And learning how to negotiate with trade unions. It was a really kind of formative time for me. I was in my 20s then. And I also learned about the importance of mentoring. So I had some great mentors who really kind of helped me on my way and kind of taught me how to sort of challenge the status quo, but also manage to take people with me. And I think I apply that probably every day in my job now. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. After that, I did something completely different. I went and worked in the private sector as a management consultant. And that was on the back of having done this MBA. I won a prize and then got offered this job down in London working for a management consultancy. And that was incredible. Really kind of a small, fast-moving organization, really developing very fast. I kind of grew alongside it, if you like. And that quote, Michelle, I think you've seatbelted your sandwich to yourself. That comes from, you know, we were always, it was a bit like kind of getting into the Batmobile down in the kind of the basement of this kind of building that we worked in, and we'd all jump into our cars and go off and do these amazing jobs, working for people like, you know, Lloyd's and Diageo, British Airways. And I just learned so much. It was absolutely about being forged by fire. You know, it would be at the middle of a big merger or something like that, really seeing what leaders are like under pressure, having to kind of listen to that chaos and forming a shape out of it, the kind of momentum and pace of things happening in the private sector, and just learning to have a bit of chutzpah really, and know how to kind of present your ideas and get your ideas listened to. So again, just kind of a really good learning experience. And then if we move on to the next slide, I was also doing a lot of traveling around about this time. This is the Carpathian Mountains, actually. I had a fantastic month in Ukraine about 30 years ago. And this was part of it, was going into the Carpathian Mountains, which was a fantastic experience, and kind of meeting shepherds and bears and all sorts. And just now, just seeing what's happening in Ukraine, I just find absolutely unthinkable. They were just the most wonderful people. And I stayed in Lviv, which was just the most beautiful city. I think it's a World Heritage Site now. And just kind of what's going on now is just almost unthinkable. But it was a time when I was always kind of, I also got out to kind of Africa a bit, and kind of, you know, saw my first elephant in the wild, my first hippo in the wild, and just kind of, just really felt that really made me kind of think about what I wanted to do. And I just kind of, I decided that I wanted to completely change. I wanted to kind of go and work much more, perhaps in the voluntary sector, maybe in heritage or nature. And I ended up kind of working for the National Trust. And one of the things that kind of made me do that was I remember speaking to an estate manager who was working for the National Trust, and he said, I go home at night and I put my head on my pillow and I think, did I do the right thing? And I just thought, how amazing to be doing a job where that's the question you ask yourself. And that I found that a kind of a really inspiring time. If we move on to the next slide. So this is the job I did for the National Trust, first of all. So this was kind of running the Stourhead estate down in Wiltshire. Where's the usual nice man was the question I used to get asked all the time, because they'd never had a woman be the estate manager before. And it was a big change for a lot of the tenants. And again, I learned a lot about land, really. I knew nothing about land. I don't know why they gave me the job, but somebody took a punt on me. And I was dealing with kind of residential tenants and pubs and 4 farms and a big visitor business. And I really learned a huge amount doing that, about how to make stuff happen, about kind of, you know, operational leadership, and all of that kind of stuff. And if we move on to the next slide, that's also something that when I went out with one of our land agents to a golf course that the National Trust owned, and they were our tenants, they just assumed I was his secretary and said, I see you've brought a bit of colour with you. And that was often the way. It was still quite a male dominated environment, really. But it was great. And it was kind of my formative experience really in the sector. And then if we move on to the next slide, I had the chance to go out to see some of the national parks in the southwest of the US. I had 6 weeks that I was able to take to do that. And it was really amazing. They were national parks that I'd always wanted to see. And it really made me kind of think about the natural world and wanting to do more for the natural world. And if we move on to the next slide, I was talking to the guys earlier about this. This is a book by Tony Juniper, who I know some of you kind of heard speak just recently, and it's called What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? And I took it with me, and it's one of the books I read when I was in America. And I remember I was sitting by my campfire. I was camping on my own under a cottonwood tree, and it was a massive bat roost, and in the evening all the bats would kind of take off, and kind of it was just an incredible place, and it made me realize that I wanted to kind of move much closer to the fight for nature, that, you know, the National Trust was not doing that for me enough. I think actually, interestingly, since that time, it's become much more focused on nature. But that's what took me to the Woodland Trust, the next slide, which was 7, 8 years ago now when I arrived there. And it was just a small charity. It had been set up in the 70s. It had about £35 million income at the time, but it had taken itself down a really narrow burrow and was being a bit self-limited, I think. And so I learned how to kind of really instill confidence in an organisation and really kind of catch the zeitgeist at the time. The whole thing around trees was just starting to build then. And I really learned a lot about leading a charity in that sort of environment. And I did that for 5 years. And then if we go on to the last slide, ended up at the RSPB just over 2 years ago, as people were saying earlier on, and that's you know, I've been doing it just for over 2 years now. It's kind of a much bigger charity. It's got over 1 million members and 200 reserves across the UK. And it works, you know, in the UK and globally, a bit like BTO. It does a lot of science. And it's I kind of feel it's like where I'm meant to be. It's where I apply everything I've learned on that journey to date, you know, and it's proved to be a really kind of interesting and challenging time to be working in an organisation that's trying to make its utmost contribution to the climate and nature crisis, which is what I think we're here to do. And it definitely feels like I've come to the place where I can make most difference to that cause, which I really believe in. So that's it in terms of my slides. So I'll shut up and finish there, and we can maybe move on to kind of some questions and answers and that kind of thing.
Beccy, thank you so much for that. That was honestly, from a personal standpoint, amazing to hear about your journey, especially not necessarily having an educational background in ecology. I personally did a business undergrad, so it's wild to hear about someone in your current position who did something like that and kind of found the journey on your way. And I mean, touching on all the nostalgia of your childhood as well, knowing that was always there for you in a way as well, and you kind of just tapped back into that. It very much resonates with me. So thank you so much for sharing all the detailed, amazing bits of your story. It was such a joy. We really want to open the time, so we've got about half an hour left. Beccy's just given us this amazing kind of timeline and insight into her work and her life. We want everybody to get a chance to ask their questions. Of course, Kira and I have our own questions as well, just because it's such an amazing thing to have Beccy in the space with us right now. But please do either put your questions in the chat, raise your hands, and we can pass the mic on to you. And we want to give everybody priority, all the participants priority to ask their questions. And it seems like we already have one in from someone named Mia. If we're okay to get it started, Beccy, do you feel ready to answer some questions?
It's a great question, and it's a question I get asked a lot. And oh God, it's so hard, isn't it? What is your favorite bird? So I'm going to talk about a few, okay? Because I find it really hard to answer. So I absolutely love kingfishers. So I just think kingfishers are just the most exotic looking bird. And you see a kingfisher and you kind of can't believe that you're in the UK. It just feels like such an exotic colour, and it just flies like a complete dart. So I love kingfishers. And then I also love, when I went to Mull a couple of years ago, I was so lucky and I saw white-tailed eagles, and they are, I was standing by this loch and this white-tailed eagle just flew past in front of me, and they are just enormous. They're just, you can't believe again that you're in the UK. And I just so I think those are two of my favorites. But I also love long-tailed tits. Long-tailed tits I was talking about at the start, you know, I love them as well. I love just the birds in my garden. Yeah, any bird basically.
We've got one
Thank you,
from
Becky.
Rufus.
Yeah.
Thanks for the great talk, Becky. I really want to be on the RSPB Youth Council. Sorry for the rather random question, but what can I do to give myself the best chance?
Wow. Well, I think you can think about how you're going to kind of present what you've got to offer. So you will definitely have things to offer to the Youth Council, and that might be some things you've done, or it might be some stuff that you know, or it might just be that you're particularly interested in something. And I think about how you're going to kind of present that to kind of show that you deserve a place on the Youth Council. But I think we'd be really interested to talk to you. So do you know who you need to talk to?
I've emailed BTO, I've emailed the youth thing about,
Yeah.
but is that it?
Yeah, no, that's probably the best thing to do. But I can also see if somebody can talk to you. So if you want to kind of give me your email address or something like that, if you've got an email address, I can make sure that somebody gets back to you and we can have a conversation. Yeah, but great
Okay.
to know that you're interested.
Should I send it to you in the chat or what?
Yeah, put it in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rufus. We also have a question just a bit above that I don't want us to miss from Cheryl Langley. What is the most endangered British bird?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. I mean, curlew we're really worried about at the moment. So curlew are really threatened. And, you know, some of you probably know this, but, you know, basically their productivity. So the number of chicks that they're producing every year is just not keeping pace. So the population is really shrinking. And we're very long-lived birds. So sometimes it feels like they're not, you know, people say, well, oh, I do see curlew, etc., etc. But of course, you get quite a lot of extra curlew in the winter, but you also get kind of very long-lived curlew. But it's this productivity rate that's really worrying. So there's quite a lot of kind of collaborative work going on between different, you know, organizations and individuals to try and do something about it. But I feel really worried about that. And I feel really worried about kind of just how many species are on the red list now. So I think in 1996 it was half the number that are on now. So you just kind of feel like there's this overall decline going on, and some particular categories of bird, like farmland birds, for example, have really crashed, and that population is continuing to go down. So it's kind of it's a worrying time, I think. I think we can do something about it. I always have hope. But, you know, we need to really kind of crack on now because we've got some big declines on our hands.
I think that leads quite nicely into Sarah's question before we move on to the rest, if you want to ask it.
Yeah, Kira and I had a meeting before this and we were kind of going back and forth about our questions for you, but I think something that especially young people in fields of ecology, ornithology, across the board, anything regarding nature, something that a lot of us are feeling right now is something that's been named as ecological grief or ecological anxiety, with the kind of pylon of information and fear and just general kind of concern that's growing, obviously due to climate change and loads of other factors that are contributing to the loss of habitats and birds on the red list and all the things that we're discussing here today. So I just kind of wanted to ask you maybe how you cope with these feelings since you're in the field in such a present and day-to-day way, and also maybe one or even more than one kind of positive or optimistic piece of news or research or policy making that you can think of off the top of your head that can kind of give us something to look at and more inspiration to look into more things like that.
Yeah, okay. So I think you're right. I think a lot of people are feeling that, particularly people who work in this kind of field or who volunteer in this kind of field. And funnily enough, I was just talking to Lee Schofield, who's our site manager up in Haweswater in the Lake District, and he's just written a book called Wild Fell, which is a brilliant book. If any of you get the chance to read it, I'm going to wave it at you here. Here we go. It looks like this. And it's great, and it's all about the work he's been doing up at Haweswater to really try and kind of restore that landscape and kind of make it rich in nature again. It's where the last golden eagle in England disappeared in 2015, and it's he was saying to me that he's been having a bad time recently, and he's been feeling kind of, you know, really sort of overwhelmed by it. And so what can I say? I feel the same sometimes, and I think these are the things that help me, okay? And people will have their own things that help them. It really helps me to know that I am trying to do something about it. So if, you know, even if that's just a kind of a really small thing, like, you know, building a pond in my garden or whatever, you know, just doing something that you feel is really going to make a difference in your patch, I think definitely helps me. I would also say that I think there are some really interesting things you can kind of read as well. So there was a very good book that was out around the time of COP26 last year by Christiana Figueres, you know, called The Future We Choose. And she basically says we have a choice, right? You know, it doesn't have to be like this. We can choose for it to be different, and it's going to take all of us, but we can make those choices. And I think there's some really kind of good optimistic writing around as well. And I think just yeah, take joy in the small things. So even while you might know there are some kind of really kind of serious things going on in the world, take joy in going for a walk for half an hour and seeing what plants have come up, or seeing kind of, you know, what the birds are up to or whatever. I think I find that's really good for my mental health. It's just kind of getting out there, taking a walk, breathing the air, you know, and just watching nature does me a lot of good, actually. And in terms of kind of things that I can make me feel more optimistic, I think so some of the species work that's gone on in terms of things like kind of bittens, for example, you know, cranes. There are some real success stories around species in the UK at the moment. And often that is actually BTO and us and other organisations working together to achieve that. And I think that's really positive. I mean, you know, it's amazing to look at crane numbers. I went to Somerset last summer, and to see a crane with a crane chick was just brilliant. How amazing. So I think some of that species work. I think things like Haweswater, things like kind of, you know, big kind of nature restoration where habitat is really being brought back. And it comes, and, you know, and nature responds quickly when that happens. And that's really uplifting to see as well. And then I think just some of the kind of actually some of the policy work that goes on in governments, you know, things like getting the species target in the new Environment Act, saying that we want to halt the decline of species by 2030. I mean, that I would have been amazed if you'd said to me 10 years ago, we're going to have a government act that said it's going to halt the decline of species. So, you know, there are some positive things happening as well.
Thank you for such a comprehensive answer. That was amazing.
So we've got a question from Maria.
Yeah.
Which is, what are your thoughts about human gull conflicts we are seeing since the 1980s? Is it feasible to protect gull species which are declining in the wild while preventing harm to be done to the human population?
So this is, you know, yeah, there are certain birds, aren't there? Funny enough, I was reading something tonight about rooks. You know, there are certain birds that we just have this kind of cultural, you know, antipathy towards, you know, and I think, you know, for a long time, people have seen rooks as kind of omens of evil and kind of, you know, they're going to peck the eyes out of lambs and then I think, you know, actually gulls suffer a bit from some of that as well. And I think seabirds generally are very challenging to protect. I think it's a really big ask. We do a lot of work at the RSPB with BirdLife, which is the international partnership around things like albatross, for example. And obviously kind of things like kittiwake nesting sites are kind of a real worry at the moment, running out of nesting sites. I think it is feasible, but you have to think on quite a grand scale. So I think you have to think about habitat, you have to think about nesting site, you have to think about food. We've just heard today actually that the taking of sand eels is going to be really reduced DEFRA have just announced that, the government department have just announced that this year, which is great, obviously, for birds like seabirds like puffins. So I think it is possible to kind of to do it, but I think it is really challenging. So, you know, you have to kind of think on a really kind of holistic scale if you're going to do it. Sorry, that's not a particularly precise answer on gulls. It's more about seabirds, but yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you for that, Becky, and thanks for the question, Maria. We have another question right after that coming in from Lucy, asking, what is your current job like on a day-to-day basis?
Oh, it's hard. Gosh, yeah. So yeah, it's really challenging. I wouldn't want it any different. I quite like that. I'm up for a bit of challenge, but it's really varied, you know. So one minute I'm kind of thinking about how we could work better with a big kind of landed estate and helping our team kind of think about that. And the next I'm kind of trying to influence George Eustace, the minister, to kind of, you know, put in place some good kind of policy. And the next minute I'm kind of, you know, worrying about whether we've got enough staff capacity to do something. So it's really varied, which I really like. But I think it's incredibly challenging at the moment, I think, because the external context is so changeable, you know. So we've just had the whole awful kind of conflict in Ukraine come into being, you know, and what that means, of course, is that everybody starts thinking differently about energy, for example. And so we then think, okay, if there's going to be a big rush towards offshore wind, you know, what's that going to mean for seabirds, and how are we going to try and kind of influence the decisions that are made about where offshore wind goes? It means that there's suddenly a change around how people think about food security, you know, and you get some of the kind of farmers unions saying, actually, forget all this rubbish about rewilding. We just want to kind of, you know, intensify food production. So, you know, it's a very changeable external environment at the moment, and that makes the job particularly challenging.
Great answer. We've got a question from Aaron, and he says, I know you get asked this a lot, but what is the best way for me to help? I'm 8 years old.
Oh, okay. So I think there are lots of things to do. I think, first of all, kind of learn everything you can. So, you know, talk to people who know about kind of birds and wildlife, you know, get out there and watch things, kind of read books, kind of look stuff up on the internet, you know, really kind of learn all the time. And I think that's it. And also, when you're 8, believe me, you can learn so much faster and so much better than someone who's 55, because it's all downhill now for me, but your brain is just like ready to absorb stuff. So kind of learn as much as you can. And then I think also think about, if you're lucky enough to have a garden, think about what you can do in your own garden. So there's things you can do around kind of making your garden a bit wilder. You can think about making a little pond if you haven't got a pond, or just a small kind of tank in the earth. You can think about kind of feeding some birds if you think, you know, that would be kind of a good thing to do. So there's stuff you can do in your immediate area. And then I think you can think about being a member of an organisation like the RSPB or BTO, and just kind of engaging that way. And then just kind of talk to all your friends about it. Don't be, I think sometimes people are, if they think, oh, I like birds, and maybe that's not very cool. I think, you know, actually it's really cool. A lot more people kind of are interested, I think, in the natural world now. So kind of talk to your friends, talk to everybody about it, because that's the way people get to understand what's going on in the natural world, and why it's important to you means it might be important to them. And I think that really matters as well. So there's tons of stuff you can do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Becky's absolutely right. I mean, I talk to my friends about birds all the time, and although I had an initial hesitation about that, now they're as interested as me, basically, and sending me pictures of every single bird they see. So do be prepared for that as well. But that was a really great question, Erin. And we have another one from Mia. Mia's asking, what types of birds do you get in your garden, and how do you get them to come? Which you touched on a bit, but would love to hear more about what you see in your garden, Becky.
So in my garden, I get blackbirds, I get goldfinches, I get great tits and blue tits and long-tailed tits. And I get, occasionally I get siskins, occasionally I get black caps, and I get greenfinches. I feel really lucky. I get a lot of greenfinches, and their numbers are really kind of going down at the moment. So it's great to get lots of greenfinches, and they all look healthy, which is good. And what else do I get? Oh, I think that is, oh, I had in the winter, I had some lovely redpoll, a little flock of redpoll came to visit me, which was lovely. So I would say that's about it. Occasionally I get a flyover from a buzzard from the allotments down the road. And what do I do to I do feed the birds, so there's bird food out there. I do have a pond, and I noticed that the goldfinch in particular love hanging out around the pond. I try and leave it a little bit wilder, so I've got lots of kind of big kind of shaggy shrubs which provide good shelter, and I let the grass grow in the summer. I don't cut the grass, so the whole thing. Oh yeah, because I get dunnocks as well, and they love kind of working their way through all of that. And so I think the whole thing is just a bit wilder and a bit kind of, it's kind of, I think you have to think about food, you have to think about water, and you have to think about shelter. And if you can get all of those feeling a bit nature friendly, you'll definitely get birds.
Brilliant. We've got another question from Freddie. He says, thank you for the really inspiring talk. I'm interested to know about your English literature degree and how it has helped you in your career to date. This is something I too really enjoy alongside the natural world. But to say English is amazing. Yay!
So well, you see, I think, you know, well, I think that reading lots of English literature gives you that sense of narrative, and by that I mean kind of how a story goes and how to kind of tell a story. And I think that really matters in any job where you're having to kind of work with lots of people, because people respond to stories. So if you understand how stories work, I think it helps you communicate, and it helps you think about how you're going to describe things to people. I think it's you also, I think I would say this, wouldn't I, but I think you learn a lot of empathy by reading a lot. You learn to kind of know how other people live their lives, and you get to kind of see all sorts of perspectives. And I think that's also really, really useful when you're trying to kind of, you know, take forward an agenda like nature, and you're going to be trying to kind of talk to lots and lots of different people from lots and lots of different backgrounds about it. And I think that really helps. And I also think you kind of learn how an argument can be made and how an argument can be structured, and that's really useful if you're trying to influence, say, a piece of government policy. You know, you have to be able to think about where the government's coming from on it, and you have to know how to make your arguments about the changes you want to see, and I think you learn that as well. So I think there's lots that you can apply from it to a job like mine, actually. It's not the most obvious degree to have, but it definitely has some kind of what they call transferable skills, some transferable things you can take from it.
Yeah, I just have to add that I do a history degree. And just utilize, the humanities are so broad that it allows you loads of opportunities to explore things in completely different ways. And it sort of leads on to my next question, which is my personal one, which is about, as a leader, what sort of qualities do you think you've brought to the RSPB?
Oh, you'd have to ask them. I'll tell you what I've tried to bring, and then you'd have to ask them to see whether they agree. I've tried to, and I'm still doing this, so I wouldn't say I've necessarily succeeded yet. I've tried to bring kind of a sort of a way of talking more effectively to the outside world about what we do and why it matters. So really kind of thinking about how we do that and tell our stories really well. I've tried to bring a sense of ambition and direction, because I think, you know, the nature and climate crisis is huge, right? I mean, I think it's the battle of our lives, really. And so you know, certainly of my generation and your generations as well. And I think you have to be ambitious about what we need to get done. And so I've really tried to bring that. I've tried to bring a sense, I haven't succeeded in this yet, I've tried to bring a sense of kind of getting all the different bits of the organisation to work really well together. Because it's a big organisation, and any big organisation can sometimes struggle to get all its different bits moving in the same direction. So I've really tried to do that. I've tried to kind of relax things a bit, I think. You know, it can be quite a sort of, it felt a bit, I don't know, hierarchical and formal, and I've tried to kind of get that to relax a bit, I think. Yeah, but you'd have to ask them. They'll tell you what they think I've done that's good and not so good.
I think they'd probably confirm that you're bringing those things, Beccy. Just from one call with you right now, it's really obvious that you bring a lot of passion and a lot of experience and energy into what you do. So it's amazing to see you right in front of our eyes right now.
Oh, that's nice of you to say so.
I do want to open the floor to any final questions as we're getting, but I wish the participants kind of have their seat at the table and ask any last few questions you have for Beccy. Mia has raised a hand. Mia, go ahead and ask your question on the mic if you'd like, or in the chat, and I can read it out to Beccy.
Is there anything you haven't done yet in your career that you want to?
That's a good question. See, I don't think about it as a career. It's just a series of things that I've done that have kind of, you know, always grown on the next thing. I would love to be able to just I would love to spend some more time deep in nature, in kind of different places. That's what I miss. You know, I think when you're working in conservation, you can sometimes end up, it just becomes kind of a heap of stuff that you have to do, you know. And I always have, like, my list is always pages longer than I've got time to do. And I would love to just spend more time just being in nature and really learning about different species. That's what I would love to do. Yeah, sometimes I go and I spend time, you know, with one of our wardens or out of one of our reserves, and I think, oh, I quite like to do your job, actually, you know. And they would say, oh, actually my job's got hard stuff as well. But I just, that time in nature, I think, is so special, and you learn so much from it. And just kind of slowing down. People always say, if you just go somewhere and just, you know, sit still for 10 minutes and see what happens around you in terms of the natural world, that's so true. And I would just love to do a bit more of that.
Oh, we've got one from Aaron, and he says, I've been reading Beak, Tooth and Claw and a natural history book from DK, and I'm really enjoying both. Do you have any more book recommendations?
I have loads of book recommendations. So definitely Wildfell, this one that I mentioned by Lee Schofield, is really, really good. I would also recommend anything by Tim Dee. I talked about Tim Dee earlier on. He wrote a fantastic book about spring called Greenery, which I just think is brilliant, and I would really recommend that. I've also got his poetry anthology. There's a really good book called Rebirding by Benedict MacDonald, which is really exciting, about thinking about kind of big landscapes and birds in big landscapes. I would also recommend, what else would I recommend? Oh, I've just read Adam Nicholson's book all about seabirds, The Seabird's Cry, I think it's called. That's really, really good. There's loads of good writing now, actually. I could go on forever, but there's some really good things that you can read. And I think really accessible writing as well. It doesn't have to be kind of heavy going. You know, you can read some really accessible things that just kind of bring stuff to life for you. Yeah.
I just thought I'd add there that we do actually have Mary Colwell coming up for
Yes,
Nature Natter. So
she'll be great. She'll be
So
great.
you'll get the opportunity to ask a question to her as well about the book.
Yeah, yeah.
I think Sarah's got another question.
I'm going to come in and ask a question. I really admired just your honesty about your journey and the way that you did English Lit and talked about art and creativity and writing, and that being a huge part of your journey in terms of your admiration for nature. And I just thought that was amazing because I'm very interested in the creative side of it as well. But I just wanted to ask you, in terms of creativity and creative expression and science communication, what do you think is missing right now? And what are the gaps that need to be filled in terms of communicating what's going on at places like the RSPB, BTO, and other conservation efforts, and communicating that to people, because that's really how we get far with it.
Yeah. So I think a few things. One is that I think there is some great science going on in our world, but we're not always very good about communicating it in a way that makes it accessible for people. So I think we could really challenge ourselves around that. I think it's really important that we don't constantly tell stories of doom. You know, it's quite easy to end up always telling stories of doom because there are these big declines going on. But I think we always need to offer people hope and kind of, you know, a way in which they can help. And I think it's really important to bring those two things together. I think it's easy when you're in this world and you're kind of starting to learn more and more, it's easy to forget how little most people know about the natural world now. You know, it's not taught much at school. It's kind of, you know, people really don't know very much at all. And I think we have to remind ourselves always to start from where people are at and don't make assumptions about what people know. I think those three things are really important.
That was amazing, Becky. Thank you so much. We're in our last 3 minutes now. So if there's one kind of shorter last question that somebody wants to ask, the floor is open. But otherwise, I just want to give my biggest thanks to Becky and to my co-host here. It's been such an incredible session. I've learned so much myself, and I think everybody's going to leave here today being really, really feeling good about what they've heard today. So thank you, Becky.
It's been so great
And
to meet everybody.
The slide up is Becky's Twitter, so definitely follow along so you can hear more from her and get in touch on Twitter if you ever really want to ask any other questions. And I think we have a few slides about what's coming up with BTO. We've got Lizzie's session on bird ID by sound for Birding 101 coming up, which should be really great. These are really informative sessions that everybody has access to. Faye says next Tuesday. Thank you for that, Faye.
Well, this is the amazing Sophie Benbow, and she is the head of marine at the Flora and Flora International. And that will be our next Nature Natter, and that's on Wednesday, the 6th of April. So sign up now on BTO's website. It's definitely it'll be an interesting one.
Yeah, should be great. Should be great.
And we've also got bird camp. So if you want to meet other young birders or other young people interested in nature, doesn't matter how experienced you are, there's camps across all over the UK this year, which is amazing. So we've got England, Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, and they're really exciting. Loads of cool events. I've heard so many positive things about it. So it looks to be really, really exciting. So yeah, apply now. And there's the equipment donation scheme. If you don't have binoculars or if you don't have a bird guide, but you would like one, then you can apply for free equipment from the BTO so that you can use it. It's an amazing scheme. Yeah. Yeah, you can contact us at youth@bto.org. we're always happy to answer questions and hear from you guys. Thanks.